Jenny Duan, welcome to the Clinical Tea. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm super excited for our conversation.
Yeah, so one question I like to ask all my guests, I want to do a little bit of an icebreaker. And without needing to drop any brand names or company names, what is a wellness or health trend you think needs to go?
Ooh, I think that this trend of over optimization and of counting your calories, counting your macros, doing that all the time is exhausting. And I think that um, it's something that I don't do anymore, that I think more people are coming to the realization of actually.
Yeah, no, completely agree. So I think we are going to start off a little like strong. First of all, you just closed an $11 million seed round for Clair Health. You also just graduated from Stanford not too long ago, so fairly recently. And then you have so many venture firms backing you up, like Costa Ventures led the round, and then as well as A16Z Speedrun, Bridge Club, all these like huge names in the startup world. And you're doing all of this with Abhinav, your co-founder. And Claire Health is the first continuous non-invasive hormone monitor for women. First of all, like, how does all of that feel? Like, what is going through your mind? Like, you and Abhinav, like, what are you all thinking? Like, when this all of this is happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were just really excited about the opportunity to bring this technology to the world. And for me personally, it was a super busy week. It was graduation, funding announcement, then it was my birthday. So a bunch of huge milestones. My parents and sister came in town, so it was very hectic in general. But I think, new funding always means new opportunity, and it means that we finally have the support and the backing, the institutional backing to bring this change to all of the women that we serve. So that's ultimately what we're most excited about. And I think funding is only the first step to the vision that we're building towards.
Yeah, all of that's incredible. Congratulations and also belated happy birthday. I'm sure your parents are super proud of everything that you and Abhinav are building. I do want to backtrack a little bit. I did read that you worked with women experiencing domestic violence and homelessness in high school before any of this ever happened. What about that experience taught you about being a woman and also dismissed by a healthcare system? And how do you think those moments shaped your drive, ambition, and goals for Claire?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was in Portland volunteering at Rosehaven, what I saw was that women, especially those experiencing at least one degree of marginalization, were really struggling to be understood. And this wasn't just a one off experience, it began to be. I began to see it as a systemic failure that our healthcare system and really our institutions don't understand women's bodies to the extent that they could. And also that there aren't enough resources, not enough doctors, not enough providers, not enough medical research out there to really support all of the unique health conditions that women experience. So this is something that really frustrated me, and especially as someone with an irregular cycle, someone who's watched her mother go through perimenopause and menopause, it I think eventually got to the point where it felt like, I watched as a decade went by and not much really changed on a systemic level. Obviously, there's been a lot of amazing innovation, but I think we are just entering a movement and a moment where I think women's health is finally getting the attention that it deserves, and I can't wait to watch as more and more innovation comes out, more support across the board comes out into women's health, and I think it'll make such a huge difference in not just one group of women, or just not just fertility, which I think women's health has been constrained to in the past, but really how can we better understand autoimmune conditions, how do we better understand perimenopause, bone density, and all of the other comorbidities that may occur.
And I'm so curious, Jenny, like how old were you when you first kind of were able to wrap your head around all of this and the disparities that women were facing? I'm just so curious to know because I know for sure, like with me, when I was in high school, I wasn't thinking about any of that. So I'm very intrigued by Was it like a series of events that led to this epiphany that you had, or after, like seeing your mom obviously going through irregular cycles and how it affected you and her, I'm sure. What were kind of, was there one particular moment, or was it like a series of just eventful and momentous occasions similar to that where you were describing, like seeing that in the volunteer work that you were doing, or even like what you were experiencing on a personal level, like within your family? What was that like?
Honestly, I think it was a series of experiences. Growing up, I didn't have exposure to startups. That wasn't really an environment that I saw around me. But what I did have exposure to and what I spent a lot of my time doing was social advocacy. Being from Portland, Oregon, I think that's a place where a lot of grassroots activism starts. And so I did a lot of volunteering at my science museum, working on science communication, which I'm very inspired with what you do now. I think science communication is so important, as well as with women nonprofits and with women's experiences at Rosehaven. And so I learned pretty quickly about the importance of movement building and of building community around these different advocacy areas. And I think seeing things emerge as not just single point experiences, but rather a series of patterns, especially in the women's health experiences that I was seeing, is what inspired me. So I wouldn't say there was a particular moment, but I knew very early on in high school that women's health was an area that I wanted to make an impact in some way.
So did you know that you wanted to build a startup? You wanted to get to a place where Claire is right now? Like, is that something you envisioned for yourself, or did you just know that you wanted to be a part of change within like the women's health industry, but you weren't necessarily sure like what that was going to look like?
Yeah, I think it's more so the latter, that I knew I wanted to be a part of some change without necessarily knowing what that would look like. Actually, when I was in college, I went through a bunch of different career explorations. I used internships to explore different pathways. Like I worked in media for a movie producer and author. I spent a summer in New York working at a hedge fund, and I also spent time in college when at a think tank in Washington, D.C. And at the end of my college experience, before I started Claire, I actually thought I was going to go into law and practice as an attorney, specifically focused on digital ethics, social media, and specifically like women's rights online. I studied AI ethics in college, and so that's always been a long-standing passion of mine, using technology to better not just understand, social media and communities, but to make an improvement in things like privacy, in deepfakes, and in online trafficking. So that's what I was passionate about before, what I thought I was going to do full time before Claire. But then I met up and I has a background in wearables, and our conversations kicked off, and now we have a company. But I think when I got into college, I had no idea that I would be starting a company, right out of school.
Yeah, and I want to talk about your co-founder story, like how you and Abhinav like met a little later, but you did mention that you studied AI ethics. And typically I see a lot of founders in like the startup landscape, that are building wearables. They either have like an engineering background or something similar. So with your background specifically, like what does an outsider's brain like usually catch in that moment that a traditional like medical device founder might miss?
Yeah, I mean, I what I love most about startups and innovation is that it's always allowed people outside highly regulated and maybe highly hierarchical industries to make a difference in the space that they're in. And one of the examples that I like to think about is that the woman who invented the pregnancy test, the urine pregnancy test, before that, she didn't have any experience in biomedical science. She wasn't a doctor. She actually had a design background and worked at a product design firm before that. And so that's an area where I feel like there's always been room for innovation and disruption. I think for me, my educational background in AI ethics taught me how to think in a very interdisciplinary way. It taught me how to wear different hats from all the different industries that I worked in, and also taught me to think about technology in a way that is used to advance, human life and to advance human potential in some way. And so I think that Clair is an intersection of all of those values that I learned in college.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. And for those that don't know, the way I actually found out about Claire was I was scrolling through LinkedIn as one does, and then I actually saw I think one of the first announcements, and I think the headline was Claire, like the world's first hormone monitoring for wearable for women, is no longer like building in stealth mode, and that was like a really strong hook for me because we're seeing, especially now with like social media, like founders, whether you're a CPG founder or whether you're a tech founder, whatever industry you're building in, people believe that building in public is almost part of like the founder journey. And I'm curious to know, like with you and Abhinav, did you both intentionally decide to build in stealth mode? Like how did that even, who decided what and why?
Yeah, I mean, actually, this is funny because in college, I used to be a social media content creator. I made college lifestyle videos on TikTok and Instagram. I did brand partnerships. It was a whole thing. I ran a social media organization on my college campus. So I was very much in the public eye a lot of the time and posting my day to day life publicly. But it was a very intentional choice when I started Claire to actually take a step away from that, archive all my videos, and really move into a different phase in my career. And I think that, for some companies and for some founders, building in public is an amazing thing. It allows them exposure, new ideas. Um, to some people, it's an avenue to track their progress over time. But for us, what we really cared about was delivering a new technology as fast as possible. And at least in the very beginning, we were very much focused on whether or not this was even possible, if we could build it, the data, what the research was saying. And so I just think about it as a balance of time. I think at that time I couldn't spend a single second away from the actual technology and the team. But now that I'm thinking about the next phase in our journey, I definitely think that telling a lot of my story publicly might be helpful for people who are looking to start their own companies or to empower other female founders on similar quests. So I've kind of embraced that a little bit more. But it's definitely always something that I feel like I have to split my time between, whether it's telling the story or building, and I feel like it rotates in phases.
Yeah, and I love that you're bringing that up, that how time constraints can definitely take your focus away from like what you're trying to build, because there are specific founders that need to build in public because then it generates like traction for what they're building. I think I see that a lot in like the CPG space, but for something like Claire that is in like the medical device and wellness industry, do you think that there is more of a need to protect what you are building when you're like the earlier stages of your company? Because in my opinion, like when I see a medical device versus like a CPG product, I'm more concerned about questions surrounding validity of like the wellness or medical device versus like a CPG product, like, food or a new like protein ice cream or something similar. But yeah, do you think that protecting the technical part of what makes your device or your brand or your product stand out is also part of like building in stealth mode?
Absolutely. I think there is an element when you're bringing something new into the world that you want to protect your IP, your strategy. I think when people see something that they don't understand, there always is a tendency to be afraid or to be confused or to dismiss it. And so when we think intentionally about whether or not we need to make any announcement, whether we share what we're doing, we are always prepared that there may be pushback from people who don't necessarily understand or haven't spent time with our team. And so I think it was a balance of when we were ready to, tell the world about what we're building versus the product being in a state where we didn't feel like it was, ready to be shared with the world yet. And I think even now, having our product out there, there's still a lot of communication that will be rolling out over the coming months, a lot of our science that we'll be sharing, but there is all of this tension, of course, with like, especially, being a wellness device versus a medical device and what you can share publicly about your science there. Because, there's FDA regulations, there's other regulations in place, but also in terms of the IP, what you can broadcast publicly and wanting to be transparent and share as much as you can with your consumers and obviously build that trust while also protecting, your science and your IP, especially as a very early stage company. I think it's always a balance that founders have to, it's a thin line that founders have to walk.
I will say though that when I saw the headline that you were getting out of stealth mode and you launched the landing page, which by the way has evolved sold out of your pre-sale orders, and you have a 25,000 people waitlist. Is that correct?
Yes, actually, it's over 30,000 now, but we're super happy that the number continues to rise.
Okay, that's amazing. And like I said, it is refreshing to see um, a startup company and a wellness device where the first announcement that gets put out, everything just kind of is put together. You have the aesthetic of Claire, which is so beautiful. It's very sophisticated, and it almost attracts intrigue, or it makes it even more appealing because you want to find out, like, wait, I didn't know that this person was even like building behind the scenes, and now we're seeing everything, everything from like product pictures to the website and announcement of like, the wait list, and it still builds, intrigue and excitement, and it definitely attracted so much attention. Were you and Abhinav surprised at like how quickly the wait?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were really excited that other women and other people were just as excited about Clara as we were. I mean, bringing a new product into the world, you can never really anticipate the response. You never know how people are going to react, but it's been overwhelmingly positive. And I think what we've loved most is hearing women's stories. We've gotten so many DMs, so many emails about women just sharing, how they've been dismissed by their doctor, how maybe they went a decade without knowing that they had undiagnosed PCOS or PMOS now that was causing their infertility, about how perimenopause and tracking their hormones and going on hormone replacement therapy actually 10x their quality of life. And so I think that's been the most validating thing, just hearing people share about all the ways that they would be excited to use Claire, and really people of all ages just sharing in the excitement. I think something that we focused a lot on is just this aspect of building community and building a movement around women's health research. We really try to support, the entire industry and community as a whole, because I think women's health is a space that has been considered niche for a long time, but 50% affects 50% of the population. And so we're just excited that the industry as a whole is getting so much more support.
Yeah, and I want to talk about going back to Abhinav. So I see a lot of solo founders, and I've seen, so many news articles about how it's almost possible to build a very successful startup or company to where it gets to like $1 billion valuation with just like one founder. How important is it for you, or was it for you at the time, to find somebody who could join you in this journey, or was it just something that happened coincidentally because of Abhinav's background and like what you were trying to build, and he also believed in the vision that you had for Claire?
I absolutely don't think that this company would have been possible without him. I think it was for sure a team effort, and that without him, I mean, he's the heart and soul of our machine learning research, of our technology, and the one who built out our hardware team. And so I think he made such a huge difference in the business. Like, there really wouldn't be any Claire without Abhinav.
Yeah, that's amazing. The what you both have accomplished, I imagine, in such a short period of time, because it feels like you, based on like what has been put out there, you met not too long ago, and fast forward to today and you're raising and just closed like an $11 million round. So within, those moments, Jenny, like what did you and Abhinav go through? And you don't have to like go through all of them, but like what were the most memorable, I guess, like hardships that you and him like went through together as like co-founders that you never really, shared in public, especially with you building in stealth mode?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first stories that we like to tell is like we started the company with so much conviction that women needed access to their hormone data that we pretty much dropped everything. And we even hired our first two employees without a single dollar in the bank account. And so that forced us to raise really quickly, make things happen. And there's a moment in time where we didn't even know if we could make the first payroll for engineers, but that was just how much conviction we had in the business and also in the need that women were experiencing. Like we thought about, delaying the company to wait longer to raise more, but we knew that if we wanted to bring this to life, we couldn't wait a single more second. And so, yeah, we ended up again hiring our first two employees without any money, then raised really quickly our first angel checks after that, and then I think everything took off. But there's definitely been so many moments where we didn't know if our business would succeed. We didn't know if we would be able to raise the next round of funding. We didn't know, if things could be handed off, to the right people. And so I think building a startup is a real roller coaster. The way that Abhinav and I like to think about it is it's like we are firefighters, but the entire city is on fire all of the time. So it's all about prioritization, lots of late nights figuring out how do we work as hard as possible to bring this product to life, and how do we build the best team to do it. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely been a challenge along the way, but very, very rewarding at the same time.
Yeah, I imagine. I feel like because entrepreneurship is almost, it's constantly celebrated versus like having a 9 to 5 right now, especially in social media. But what people don't understand is that you are actually signing up for a job that is 24/7. Like there's no such thing as like taking a break, especially in the early stages of a company. And you were just talking about fundraising, which I know, from my friends that are currently like fundraising at the moment in like the tech space, it is a full-time job in itself, and sometimes it can be very demoralizing. So I want to talk about a little bit about the fundraising trenches. So without naming any names, were there investors that you and Abhinav encountered who actually did take the meeting and then they listened to your pitch, and then you could just tell that they weren't in full belief and they didn't have the confidence in either of you that, you know, a device could actually track hormones non-invasively? Like what were those conversations like?
I mean, yeah, fundraising was an uphill battle and a full time job for sure. I think there's several, investors who didn't really understand the space, a lot of explaining, even what perimenopause is, or the fact that not everyone has a regular 28-day cycle, which are things I feel like should maybe be taught in like high school curriculum, but aren't. And then there were also, conversations where, yeah, like people didn't really understand our technology, didn't fully understand what the vision that we were trying to build. And I think that was frustrating. It was very frustrating to get dismissed, oftentimes without even the opportunity to tell our story fully. But at the same time, I think both sides are true. There's obviously challenges, but I think there's also a lot of investors, ones who invested in us and those that didn't, that were very pleasant to work with and very curious, genuine. And so I think, for women, especially female founders, I think a, a lot of us maybe sometimes put high expectations on ourselves to perform a certain way, or um, like a lot of female founders I've seen, and I've even experienced this myself, like tend to disqualify ourselves even before a conversation happens. And so I would always encourage founders to put themselves out there and to not be the one to reject themselves, because for us, it was definitely challenging, but we ended up finding the best partners, former health tech founders and operators, MDs and PhDs. Our lead investors at Cosa Ventures are all MDs and PhDs with experience both in electrical engineering and also, have clinical, both medical and research backgrounds. And so eventually, I think that it's easier to say that everything works out when you're on the other side, but truly everything works out the way that it should.
I feel like when you're pitching to investors, it also is, it's a two-way street. It's not just necessarily like you know, finding somebody who's willing to give you money, but they also have to be the right fit for Claire and whether or not they actually are as passionate as you and Abhinav are in building this company. I think I see that a lot with my friends that are currently, fundraising and they're talking to investors, and it's a great way to like weed people out, and you're finding out, oh, okay, they definitely wouldn't have been a great fit if they said X, Y, and Z about the company we're trying to build. So you mentioned, of course, there is women tend to struggle more when they are trying to raise funding. And I wonder, Jenny, like somebody at your age who's so young, do you think that that was ever a not a hindrance, but was it something that you were concerned about when you were going to these pitch rooms or you're talking to investors who were, I imagine like significantly older than you and they were men? Like, did you feel like your age and you being a woman held you back when you were pitching to investors, or is it something that you leveraged more as an unfair advantage?
Yeah, I mean, raising venture funding is challenging for anyone at any stage in life. And I think being a young founder and a first time founder, I didn't necessarily view it as a hindrance or an advantage, but really an opportunity to prove myself and to show that despite my age, despite being a young woman, that I have the chops and I have the vision to build a company. And I think that being able to be in those rooms is a privilege in and of itself. I think for any founder, just the opportunity to sit in the same room, with someone who is a prominent venture capitalist or a large investor is already an opportunity. And so I try not to think about whether or not something can be a advantage or a hindrance, but rather how can I turn any scenario into an opportunity. I think that young people have built amazing things at young ages, and I think that it doesn't make a difference whatever stage in life you are. There's successful founders who start at 18 years old. There's successful founders who start their first companies at 50 years old or 60 or even 70 years old. And so I think all that matters is your mindset and the mission and the vision that you are building towards.
100% agree. And I want to talk a little bit about, the clinical trials aspect of Claire and the research behind it, because as you know, like I'm with somebody that is working in research right now and somebody that is very much in love with what is going on right now in the startup world and the health tech space. There is a statistic that I think directly inspired Claire, and I want to talk about the number that involves how women weren't required in clinical trials or even asked to participate until 1993. And I want to read this out because I think it's really, really interesting and intriguing. But for decades, the standard approach in medical research treated men as the default baseline and assuming that male biology and female biology were largely interchangeable. So, as somebody who works in clinical trials myself, and what you've seen in Claire, what do you think has changed since this statistic, this I guess like number, and what hasn't changed since then?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's shocking to see that number, and it's something that I see, over and over again on social media, but I still feel it every time I read it. Like, women weren't included in clinical trials until 1993, but I think what's more is that unfortunately, even today, women are still not being represented in clinical trials. For example, only 30% of phase one trials for any new device, product, medication include women. And 30% is a number that's very far away from the 50% expectation that I think many people have. And so even today, women are still not being represented fully in clinical trials. But what that means, practically speaking, is that the way that we apply medicine and medication dosages, the way that we diagnose conditions, and the way that we treat conditions differ so much, and the research is lacking as to how, like, even things like heart attacks affect women, or even how hormone receptors or hormones in the body can affect conditions like Alzheimer's. A lot of that research is still missing, and I don't think we have an answer for that. Even for conditions like PCOS or PMOS, which affect 1 in 8 women, or endometriosis, which affects 1 in 10 women, or 10% of the population, like, today we still don't have cures or solutions for those conditions. And so something that still frustrates me, and when it comes to the everyday consumer, when it comes to new technology, really our mission at Clair, and my personal mission, is to extend the female health span to understand what causes all of these female specific diseases. For example, 80% of autoimmune diseases affect women. And so, like, how do we use the data that we can get from all these different sources, be it a hormone tracker like a wearable like Clair, be it a blood test like Function Health, which I think is also doing amazing things in the consumer health space, or even a product like 8 Sleep. How do we use all these sources of information to advance data in women's health and in healthcare? I think that's ultimately like the big vision and the questions that I have for the next few decades.
Yeah, and earlier, Jenny, you mentioned that you kind of intentionally started building Claire as a wellness device, but you are working towards making it, I guess, like classifying it, get to a point where it's classified as a medical device. How important is it for you to make that transition from like a wellness device to a medical device, and what will that take for people that don't really know what the process is like behind the scenes? Could you give us like a high level overview of what that transition looks like, and what kind of validates a wellness device to becoming like a medical device?
Yeah, so right now, most of the wearables that you see in the market are all wellness devices, which have their own, regulations, but what that essentially means is they can't be used for diagnosis or treatment of any specific diseases or conditions. Meaning that if someone were looking for a PMOS diagnosis, they would not be able to use Claire to do that. But what we're seeking is a FDA clearance for medical use around starting with fertility and ovulation timing, but beyond that, looking at, again, these female specific conditions, looking at perimenopause and more. And I think, practically speaking, what that means is we can shorten the time to diagnosis for all of these different conditions. We can advance solutions and use continuous hormone monitoring as a tool when it comes to treating conditions like perimenopause. Of course, in the process, we will have to prove that this works in clinical settings across a diverse population of women, and those are things that we are already have in the works. We're kicking off a large trial this summer, which will enroll around 250 women. We've already had our pre-submission meeting with the FDA, and so we're feeling really confident about our approach and trying to be scientific and clinically rigorous in our approach. I think this is why we've invested the resources into doing a clinical trial and to go in that category. I think it's all about really making a difference in women's health, and how do we actually help women not just understand their cycles or their bodies better, but how do we empower them to live a healthier and better life with continuous data. I think that there will be a big paradigm shift in consumer health that's already starting to kick off, and I want women to be at the forefront of this rather than left behind, as we see with growth in so many other industries.
And also, I think with the influx of all these wellness brands, whether you're talking about like supplements, or you're talking about, wearables or continuous monitors, I feel like consumers have gotten to be really, really, really smart and a lot more cautious about what is the backing behind this. Are you just kind of making these claims versus are you, doing what Claire's doing, for example, and you're running, clinical trials to kind of validate the claims that are on your website. So I do think that it's not going to be a trend necessarily where even with CPG brands, I think when a brand claims to, be, for example, like really, really good for your gut, but then at the same time, you know, brands come back and they get slapped with all these like claims and these class action lawsuits because there wasn't enough evidence to support those claims. So I love that you are taking the necessary steps to not only focus on being a wellness device but also making it so it gets to a point where consumers feel even more confident in what you are building because you do have the data to, support what it's supposed to do. Um, and
Absolutely.
Jenny, yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Claire is not necessarily promising balanced hormones. And I think I read somewhere that you said that, hormones are not supposed to fluctuate or they're not supposed to be balanced, which I agree with 100%. They're supposed to fluctuate. So I feel like that line that you just said is, the complete opposite of what every other wellness brand tries to kind of sell to either like women or men, that it has to be your hormones or your, whatever levels you're trying to measure has to be like just static and it has to be flatline or whatever. It has to be stabilized all the time. Why is that important for you to make that distinction? And also tell our listeners what exactly Claire does to give it the data that they're supposed to, receive from like a consumer standpoint.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that when people say balance their hormones, I get a little bit frustrated because, yes, there is a relationship between estrogen, progesterone in the cycle that you might see with people with normal ovulatory cycles. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a particular concentration of any hormone that's ideal. We see from research that everyone does have a different baseline, and what is most clinically important coming from our reproductive endocrinologist who serves as our chief medical officer and the other medical advisors that we have is not just what your hormones are at a fixed point in time, but rather how are they changing over time and how does that influence your symptoms. So when I think about what matters to the consumer and what we're able to show even as a wellness device, and another note on the research is I think, just regardless of being a wellness or a medical device, companies do have the obligation either way to share clinical research and build that consumer trust. So I think clinical studies is something that we and I think any other company in this space should do regardless of their designation. But on what we're showing to users under this wellness designation is we're showing how hormones are trending in real time, which means that a user using Claire, using our app, can get a chart over time of, on a weekly, monthly, 3 month, 6 month, you name it, basis of how their estrogen is trending and how their progesterone is trending, when their LH surge is happening, and how FSH is changing. And practically what that means is that from that you can look at things like cycle length, you can look at cycle length variability over time, you can look at date of ovulation, and you can also look at how the rest of your physiology, so any symptoms that the user is tracking, we look at activity, sleep, breathing, how all of those patterns are correlating with different phases of the hormone cycle. And for someone going through fertility or perimenopause, maybe this use case is very evident. For example, knowing when you ovulate is really important if you're trying to get pregnant. And right now, urine tests only tell you a couple of days after ovulation because they measure, either the presence of LH or, progesterone's rise, which happens only after ovulation. So I think that's a distinction to be able to know more accurately the date of ovulation for fertility. For perimenopause, it's important to know how your body's symptoms are changing as your hormones are changing, and maybe as your cycle length increases and the variability increases, that could be used by a doctor as an early signal that someone may be entering perimenopause. For PCOS and PMOS and endometriosis, there are unique hormonal signatures that are associated with these conditions. So looking at your patterns over, say, a 3 month period could also be flagged potentially as something that a doctor might want to use in their own evaluation. Now, for me, someone who's not trying to get pregnant right now, not in perimenopause, and also doesn't have PMOS or endometriosis, what I would use a product like this, and what I imagine a lot of my friends and family might want to use this for is understanding their energy, understanding their physical exertion and their, for example, their rate of perceived exertion, which tells you not just how well you can perform, because studies actually show that women's performance doesn't really decrease across the menstrual cycle, which is an assumption I think a lot of people make, but rather your rate of perceived exertion changes. So how much effort you physically feel differs, not your actual like output in terms of performance. So I would be interested in learning how my energy, how my inflammation and bloating, how my mood, how my skin health, I get hormonal acne, would change across these hormones, and tracking, if I'm in a high estrogen phase, for me, that's what triggers my acne personally. And so if I can understand that, that's something I can anticipate over time. And as I'm seeing these patterns, there are steps I can take around my sleep schedule during that period of the cycle, or around the foods that I eat, that can all feed into living a more healthier lifestyle overall. So that's really the intention of our device, not necessarily to replace blood tests or to replace other health exams that people might be going through, but rather to provide context into a domain where women have never been able to see before. But that's what we're starting with. Our longer term vision and what we are going through the clinical trials to be able to claim publicly is around quantitative hormone tracking, which I think is a huge paradigm shift. That's really what our models are designed on. And so my hope is that with, of course, further evidence in future studies, we can make that visible to women for the first time.
Yeah, and I want to say, because I do follow you on socials very closely, both on like LinkedIn and Instagram, and I'm seeing that the response that you're getting from your followers is overall like very positive, which is amazing. I think women just feel almost empowered that a company like yours is actually building something to address what they've been experiencing for such a long time. And I think that's really, really important in this day and age to really just finally have almost like a digital companion just telling them that they're going to be okay, and or at least if they're not okay, then they know like this is the right signal for them to get and to use, to get the help that they need. And so selfishly, I do want to shift gears a little bit, Jenny, and ask you, because as somebody that is currently, in her MBA program, and I graduate in a couple of months, I have seen,
Congratulations.
thank you, I sort of like took reverse engineer my entrepreneurship journey. I actually got into business first, like bought and sold a business, and then decided to go into like MBA school. But I'm curious to know, because after you having just like graduated recently, what are you learning right now as a founder that's building in the health tech space, which can be very, very like complex, rigorous, and you know, stressful for sure. But like, what are you learning right now that you're actually in the trenches and you're getting your feet wet that you wouldn't have learned in school?
I think just how important building out a team is. As a founder, there are so many areas where I don't personally have a background in clinical practice, being one of them, another one being machine learning research, another one being electrical engineering. And so I think for me, it's all about assembling an early team, which can all complement who we can all complement each other in terms of skill sets, in terms of experience, and in terms of background. And so I think that's been really important. I think the other part is just having grit, having resilience, and being a lifelong learner. I think as a founder, there are so many areas where you need to try new things. You need to push yourself. You need to push the industry, maybe. And so it's about having the resilience and having the mindset for the bigger vision.
100%. And I would love to know, like, if somebody is listening to this right now and they actually want to understand their own, like, their own hormone data, with or without Claire being used, like, what's the one biomarker relationship you wish every woman should have understood before they even turn 20 or like 25 or even 30 or 40?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what they can capture in a wearable, blood testing, or what domain?
It could be either or, it could be both.
Yeah, I mean, if there was one thing I could even emphasize to my friends and family, to my sisters, are that like it actually having a healthy cycle and at least being aware of your cycle is a really important biomarker for female health. I think we know that your cycle disappears when women are, for example, very stressed, or when they are maybe overtraining, or when they're not eating a nutritious and balanced diet. And so I think seeing the cycle as almost a fifth or sixth vital sign really, really matters. And I think women in general should definitely pay attention to what they're feeling around their cycles, because so much of the time I feel like women's pain and women's symptoms are dismissed by doctors, by peers, by the community at large. And so being really in tune with that is really important.
100%. And I want to wrap up, Jenny, with some quick fire questions. So I want you to fill in the blank for this one. The wellness industry will be so embarrassed in 10 years that we never believed blank.
Ooh, this is a good one. I mean, the quickest thing that I can think of is that we never believed women were telling the truth about their pain.
What's the most, not necessarily expensive, but like could be expensive? What's the most expensive thing, or what wellness trend did you get into and now regret?
Taking a lot of supplements without necessarily needing them. And by the way, I've been loving your $100 wellness spend series.
Thank you. I so appreciate that, and I actually just, as somebody who is in the medical field and the clinical research space, I think it often becomes an issue where, ironically, a lot of us don't actually take care of ourselves, and that's what I noticed when I was like in med school and when I was in training, because of the hours that like we put into every single day to save lives and to better other people's health. We in turn didn't really take care of ourselves. So I am a late bloomer. I'm in my 30s, and I'm just now starting to like really pay attention to my health. So yeah, I appreciate that. Okay, so what is something you believed in for years that turned out to be completely wrong once you actually like did some research into it?
Ooh, I think that protein is the only thing that matters is a trend that I subscribed to for a long time. And then as I started doing more research about it, I think this year fiber has been having a moment, but I started learning about all the other important components of a healthy diet and lifestyle. And I think that really transformed the way that I think about my nutrition.
Last one. Give me one piece of tea that nobody in your specific field or industry is talking about publicly, but is something that should be talked about more.
Tea in the women's health industry. I mean, I think something that I'm really excited about, and I think there's a lot of cool companies building in this space, is the use of menstrual blood in research, specifically the stem cells found in menstrual blood. I think this will be a huge area of innovation, and I mean, there's a lot of great startups already working in this space, so I'm excited to see that get some more attention.
Wait, I love that. Okay, I love that you're bringing that up. So where can listeners find more about you, follow you in your journey now that you're no longer building in stealth mode, and where can they learn more about Clair?
Yeah, I mean, they can find me on all social media platforms under my name, and then Claire, same thing, Claire_health on all platforms.
So, well, Jenny Duan, thank you so much for spilling the tea with me, and I really appreciate you hanging out.
Of course, this was so fun. Thank you for having me.